let me say, a word in defense of reason in dialogue with faith.
Because faith is that proof. Faith unites us to that substance.
But reason, in order to realize its full potential, needs the horizons revealed by and truths contained in the faith. And not just any faith, but the Catholic faith.
So let's now talk about what are the harms that might come from redefining marriage to be the union of any two persons instead of the union of a man and a woman. I would put it to you in this way. I would say that same-sex marriage undermines some key principles of law and some key understandings of social practice. And that by undermining those key principles in law, we're going to have some negative consequences. Okay, so that's what I'd like to do, is spell out 4 principles that I believe are the key principles as we currently understand marriage, and show how same-sex marriage, how redefining marriage will undermine those principles. The first principle I've already alluded to, but I think it's an established principle in our law and social practice, and that is that children are ordinarily entitled to a relationship with their mothers and their fathers. It's a key principle in law that children are ordinarily entitled to a relationship with their mothers and fathers. And something extraordinary has to happen for that to not hold true. That adoption is an unusual situation. At one time it was thought that out-of-wedlock childbearing should be thought of as an unusual situation and should be discouraged. Of course, we've lost that a lot. And so a lot of children of single parents don't have much in the way of a relationship with their fathers, okay? And so already some steps have been taken to undermine that key principle. But same-sex marriage will, as it were, finish the job on this principle. Because same-sex marriage says that as a matter of principle, children are not particularly entitled at all to a relationship with their biological parents. That you can sever that tie with one parent, or maybe even both, with no discernible harm, for no reason other than the adults want to do it. And it's marriage that will be the vehicle that does that. Marriage will become the kind of thing that separates children from their parents, rather than being the kind of thing that attaches children to their parents. Now let me explain how that works. Right now there's a principle in law that is called the presumption of paternity. And the presumption of paternity works like this. When a woman gives birth to a child, her husband is presumed to be the father of any children that she has during the life of their marriage. Okay, so who's the mother, who's the father? This is the question. Well, when a baby is born, it's usually pretty obvious who the mother is. Right? There's usually a mother somewhere close by. Right? Usually that's pretty obvious. And so, although there are some exceptions, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, so it's pretty obvious who the mother is, and there's a presumption that the woman who gives birth to the baby is the mother of the child, right? Seems sensible to me. But who's the father? The social problem is to figure out who the father is and attach him to the child. The father's bond is always a little bit more tenuous, so that's a social job that has to get done here. So the way marriage works, right? The way marriage works is that the husband is presumed to be the father of any children that she gives birth to. Now, if you take that legal presumption and you couple it with an understanding that sex belongs inside marriage, what you've got is a system that tracks biology pretty closely. Right? Right? I mean, there's going to be adultery, and there are going to be some cases where the husband isn't really the father, and so on. But in 95% of the cases, this system is tracking biology. If you have a same-sex partnership, what would be the corresponding principle? Well, the principle that people are trying to put into place is one that replaces presumption of paternity with presumption of parentage. Presumption of parentage. Now, what that means is that if a woman gives birth to a baby, her partner, her same-sex partner, is analogously treated as the father, and she is presumed legally to be the other parent of that child. Now, of course, in 100% of the cases, this is false. Right? She is not the other parent of the child. There is another parent of the child somewhere. he has been safely escorted off the stage and kept off the stage by the legal system. All right? It's typically done by anonymous sperm donation, but it can be done by a friend. A friend who wants to help out his friends and donate a sperm and so on and so forth. But the point is, if you say that the presumption of parentage is the same thing as the presumption of paternity, you are deliberately, in advance, excluding one biological parent from that child's life. And it is the law and the law of marriage which is doing that thing. So instead of marriage being the kind of thing that routinely and consistently attaches children to both of their biological parents, marriage becomes the kind of thing that separates some children, from one of their parents. So this, I would submit to you, is a significant change. This is not a small thing. This is something that needs to be discussed and debated. And I think in the end, a rational discussion of this would show it to be undesirable, an undesirable change. So it's not simply that we don't like gay people, or that we're prejudiced, or that we're bigoted, or that we're bringing up some kind of theological point here. Okay, I haven't said a word about theology. I haven't quoted the Bible once. Haven't quoted John Paul II once, even though I could, but I'm not. Okay, these arguments, this insight is available to anyone. That this is a substantial difference that deserves to be discussed and not simply hooted down by charges of your being mean and bigoted. And that is what is happening in our very, very toxic discussion around the issue of same-sex marriage. That when you bring up these points, instead of an argument, what you get is yelling. And that's got to stop. That's got to stop. So that's the first harm, one of the first key principles, I think, that will be undermined by redefining marriage. The second one is that the second principle that I would say is more of a principle of social policy or social practice and understanding is that mothers and fathers are not interchangeable. Mothers and fathers are not interchangeable. Most people, I think, believe that to be the case based on their experiences with their parents and their mothers and fathers, that moms and dads are different. One of the ways that we can kind of see that is if you look at a lot of social science evidence, you see that the gender of parents matters when father absence is having a different impact on children than mother absence. That father absence has a different impact on boys than on girls. Okay, so gender must matter. Gender must matter. There are a lot of reasons to think that gender matters. But you can see that what's happening here is to say that mothers and fathers are interchangeable. Oh, the kids will be fine as long as they have two parents who love them. It doesn't matter whether they have a mom and a dad. All that data, Dr. Morse, doesn't really mean that. It really just means they need two parents. It doesn't matter whether they're biologically related, whether they're male, whether they're female. You're just confusing all these things. Well, no, the reason it looks like we're confusing things is because we have something that's integrated. Something that integrates biology and sex differences in marriage. Okay, so there are arguments out there. If you want to talk about the questions and answers, we can talk about some of the studies that are out there. We can kind of go through that a little bit. But the basic point here is that the claim that mothers and fathers make unique contributions to the well-being of children, that claim is now not only contested, it's in danger of being considered bigotry to even say so. So for example, in the Iowa Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage in Iowa. Did you guys know that they have same-sex marriage in Iowa? How many of you knew that? Okay. Yeah, you need to get out more, you guys. They have same-sex marriage in Iowa, and that was done by judges. And there was a footnote in the opinion that said, and this is close to a direct quote, the judge said, the idea that children need their mothers and fathers has been shown to be based on nothing but myth. It's a myth that children need their mothers and fathers. Okay, and Judge Walker said words to that effect in California as well. So now, if you took that statement and applied it as a general principle throughout society, you just took that principle and said kids don't really need a mother and a father, and you applied that generally throughout society, you would see at once that it's false. Right, as a general statement, it is certainly false. You would not go to the poor neighborhoods of Cleveland and say, it's a myth that kids need their mothers and their fathers. You know, as if there was something other than fathers that was going to solve the problems of some of the urban neighborhoods that we have, you know. So this, but the judges are making these kinds of statements because they think they must in order to defend same-sex marriage. So that's why I think that legalizing same-sex marriage will have the impact of undermining the claim that kids need a mom and a dad, and that moms and dads are not interchangeable. And one of the key problems to that, one of the very visible problems you will see flowing from that, is that it is fathers who will be marginalized from the family. Fathers will be further marginalized from the family. Men will be kicked out of the family even more than they already are. Now, you know, when you have a 40% out-of-wedlock childbearing rate, you've already gone pretty far in kicking men out of the family. Okay? So there's already a lot of energy on that point of marginalizing men from the family. But the fact is, if you treat mothers and fathers as interchangeable, it's fathers whose connection is the more tenuous, and it is fathers upon who the greater burden is going to bear. The presumption is not going to be, well, we need you around, buddy. No, there's no presumption. Nobody is going to look at two women, or at two men raising a baby together, look at Elton John and his boyfriend and say, oh, this, you see, it's just as I always knew, no one needs a mother. But people do look at two women raising a child and say, you see, it's just as I've always suspected, who needs a father? In the UK, prior to same-sex marriage they have same-sex marriage in the UK. Did you guys know that? Yeah, okay. They used to have a rule that in order to use artificial reproductive technology through their public health service over there, that you had to, if you were not married, you had to show that the child would have his or her need for a father figure would be somehow met. In other words, you had to sign a little affidavit saying, you know, yeah, there's a, you know, my brother will be a father figure, or I have an uncle, or something like that. It was a very perfunctory requirement that indicated that if an unmarried woman was going to use this service, that she needed to be able to say that there'd be a man in the child's life somehow. Well, after same-sex marriage happened, they removed that requirement. They removed that requirement because they didn't want to hurt people's feelings. Okay, I'm not even kidding, I'm not making that up. And then finally, the other thing that you should be aware of is the way that the birth certificates are getting changed in places around the world. In Canada, I used to have a birth certificate from British Columbia. The birth certificate in British Columbia, at the top of the birth certificate, it has the information for the child's name and birth weight and all that kind of stuff. Then there's a space for the mother's information can be put in. And then there's a space for the father or co-parent, a checkoff box. Okay, so fatherhood is reduced to a checkoff box. Okay, so that is why I believe that it is fathers who will be marginalized by saying that mothers and fathers are completely interchangeable. That's where this thing is headed. Now, of course, there's another way you can redo the birth certificate, which I'll tell you about under item 3 here, which is the third key principle that will be undermined by same-sex marriage, is that biology is the primary way that we now define parenthood. We define parenthood primarily through biology. When you say the word mother and father, the entire human race knows what you're talking about. Right? Children know what you're talking about. You can look at animals and go, that's the mommy horse and that's the daddy horse. Right? The entire human race knows perfectly well what you mean when you say mother and father. You mean the biological mated pair that brought this child into being. And that's what it means to be a mother and a father, biology. Now, at this point, somebody will always stand up and shout at me, you're forgetting about adoption. Well, now, I don't know how I could forget about adoption, seeing as that I'm an adoptive parent and that I'm a foster parent. But the point is, adoption does not, in fact, undermine this basic principle. Biology is the basic way that we assign parenthood. Adoption exists to deal with exceptional situations, and adoption is a child-centered exception. Adoption exists to give children the parents they need. It does not exist to give adults the children they want. That's the difference. So adoption, as currently understood, is a way of dealing with exceptional situations. But adoption is also structured in such a way as to not undermine the biological principle. In fact, when you go to adopt a child, the biological mother and father have to surrender their parental rights. You don't have three parents wandering around, right? You have, the biological parents have legally surrendered their rights, and those same rights, exact same rights, are reassigned to the adoptive parents. So you've replaced the biological parents with another set of parents that are, as close as possible, the same thing. There's no way in which you're undermining the biological principle by having a system that deals with exceptions. In fact, that's one of the strengths of our common law system, is we come up with ways of dealing with exceptions. We realize exceptional situations will happen, right? But the idea that biology is unimportant to parenthood is at the core of the redefinition of marriage. And if you see the theme that I'm following here, that since I believe marriage has something crucially to do with children, that redefining marriage is going to redefine parenthood. But nobody ever talks about how we're redefining parenthood, right? But nobody ever talks about that. Nobody ever thinks about that. And so one of the consequences that will flow from recognizing same-sex unions as the equivalent to marriage is that children will end up not just with two parents, but with three or maybe four legal parents. Biology will not be the principle by which we assign parenthood. It will be biology plus something else. And maybe biology isn't even as important as the something else. So here's a scenario that one sometimes sees in the case law now. You'll have a lesbian couple that want to have a child together. They find a friendly friend who will donate sperm to them. They make some kind of little agreement, okay, that's going to regulate the fact that he's not, maybe he'll be a favorite uncle, but he's not the parent, they're the parent, okay? And so then the question is, are these agreements enforceable at law? That's the question. He's the biological father. The woman who gave birth to the child is the biological mother. And then there's this lesbian partner who is wanting to be attached to it. So there are places and jurisdictions where there are three names going onto birth certificates. Okay? Obviously, not biology. Something other than biology is running that ship. Okay? You see that? So triple parenting will be unstoppable. There will be no principle to stop that kind of thing from happening. And if you think about it, the idea that you need two parents or two people in a married couple is really based on the biological fact of reproduction, right? You can create the one flesh union between the man and the woman. That's a complete marital unit, a complete reproductive unit. You don't need a third party in there. In fact, the third party is a problem. Usually it's kind of a problem, right? But there is no complete reproductive unit in a same-sex couple. A third party has to be introduced if they're going to have children. And so therefore, what seems natural to us now, meaning a married couple, will no longer seem natural, right? That the idea that you should have only two people in the couple, there isn't any reason to keep it at two. And some people are already starting to talk about this, and case law is already developing around it. There was a puff piece in the Boston Globe not too long ago that talked about a child with four parents, because it was a lesbian couple and a gay couple, and they had it all worked out, and it was all so cool, and so on and so forth. It was very interesting in the story, the Boston Globe story. They didn't show photographs of any of these people, but they did have like an illustration that was it showed the child kind of in the middle of these four people. It was very interesting that the illustration that they made of the child, you could not identify the gender of this child. Right, it was a unisex kind of looking child. You really couldn't tell what the gender of the child was. Okay, so what's happening to us here is we're freaked out over gender. If I could just not put too fine a point on it here, right? I mean, that's really what's happening to us, and so the throwing biology under the bus as a way of determining parenthood. Triple parenting will be one of the consequences to it, but the other consequence will be will flow from the other way you can handle the birth certificate. I want to talk to you about another way you can do the birth certificate, because this is something that came up. There was a little kerfluffle, not over birth certificates, but over passports. Passports. Some State Department functionary came up with a great idea that children's passports should not have a place for a mother and a father on them. Should have a place for parent A and parent B on them. Okay, did you hear about this? This came up a little while ago, and it was like one of these shooting stars. It came, it was showing a lot of bright light, and then all of a sudden it fizzled out and disappeared off the horizon because everybody threw up their hands and got so upset about it. You know, taking mother and father off the passport. What are you talking about? Parent A, parent B, parent 1, parent 2. What are you talking about here? But notice, saying parent A and parent B is one of the ways to handle the birth certificate too, isn't it? Okay, instead of mother and father, parent A, parent B. Now, what happens when you say parent A, parent B? That means that the woman who gave birth to the child has no particular special standing in relation to that child compared with the woman in the couple who did not give birth to the child. You would think that giving birth to the child would mean that there is an unrebuttable presumption that you are the mother of the child, right? Well, that is turning out not to be exactly quite true. Because the other woman in the couple, her claim to be the mother of the child is just as great as yours. Because the law wants to treat them equally. And what happens, I have seen quite a few, I've read quite a few of these lesbian custody cases, because there are quite a few of these disputes that come up. And it isn't uncommon to have a functioning couple decide to have a child, and then after they had the child for a while, now the relationship blows up and then they're arguing about who gets the child and what the custody disputes look like and so on and so forth. So even without changing the marriage law, we're already confronting this stuff and trying to deal with it. So what's happening is that the woman who gave birth to the child has no special standing with respect to that child over and above her partner. So it's almost as if they are both equally the mother of the child. Now I want you to just think about this. Most of you are young, most of you aren't mothers yet, but if I were to say this in an audience that had a lot of mothers in it, there'd be a big reaction, which I'll show you. Think about what it would mean to share the care of your child with another woman. Mothers, think about what it would mean to share the care of your child with another woman, even another woman whom you love. Right? Is it easy to share the care of your child with your sister, or with your mother, or with the child's nanny? It is not. And I believe that what's happened in a lot of these cases is that this attachment, the maternal attachment, flares up and surprised both of them. Surprised both of these women. They had no idea how difficult it was going to be. And yet the way the law is being driven to a place where the law itself will be reluctant to say that the one who gave birth is in any way different from the other one, that they're both equally the parent of the child, say, to wipe out biology as the principal way that we assign parenthood. It's very interesting how this is happening, but in a sense, it's incoherent. They're trying to do a number of things together that cannot be done, or that can only be done if you deny the body, if you deny that the body matters. I had lunch with your Professor Pat Lee today and talked with him about his book on dualism. And I'm really struck again and again in this debate how often people throw back to me, oh, that's just the body. Oh, that's just biology. We're above all of that. And in fact, we're not above all of that. It flares up in a whole variety of ways that people are not expecting. So that's the third point. Is that biology is a primary way we define parenthood. And there's one last one I want to mention. There's a lot I could mention, but there's one last one I want to mention. One last principle that will be undermined by same-sex marriage. And that is that currently the state recognizes parentage as an accepted biological fact. It's related to the others we've talked about. The state recognizes parentage, but the state doesn't assign parentage. The state doesn't control parentage. But as we move towards same-sex marriage, the state will be deciding who counts as a parent. The state is deciding who counts as a parent. There will be no natural parents, because that privileges one of the parents over the other. There will only be legal parents, all created by the state. And what's happening in some of the disputed lesbian custody cases is that the courts are being asked to say, does this person count? Does this partner count as a parent? And what the courts are doing, since they don't have biology to go on, and they're not quite ready to embrace the civil union's position, what they'll say is stuff like, well, they'll create 3- and 4-part tests to determine whether this is a de facto parent. And the short version is, did you wipe enough noses and change enough diapers? to count as a parent. Well, so what does that mean? That means the government is asking these kinds of questions of families. The government is looking into people's family lives to decide who counts as a parent. The great virtue of the biological principle is that that principle exists independently of what the government says. And the government's just assigning an already existing reality, or recognizing an already existing reality, rather than trying to create something out of whole cloth. And so one of the consequences of changing marriage is that the power of the state will expand greatly, not just in this area, but in other areas. Because marriage, as we understand it today, is a social reality that's an organic social reality. It can sustain itself. It's a self-sustaining thing that gives its own life and can keep itself going. Whereas same-sex marriage is entirely the creation of the state, and will need the state to sustain it. It will need the state to tell other people that how they must behave with respect to same-sex couples. It needs the state to suppress dissent. It needs the state to tell the Knights of Columbus that they must rent out their banquet hall to a same-sex couple. If they rent it out to anybody, they have to rent it out to everybody. It will tell doctors, you must perform artificial reproductive technology on any couple who comes to you. Your religious convictions don't matter. These cases have already happened. They will tell Catholic charities that they must place children with adopted children with same-sex couples, that they may not make any distinguishing differences between same-sex and opposite-sex couples. They will tell the city of Washington will tell the Archdiocese of Washington that you must pay benefits, spousal benefits, to all couples who come before you, whether you like it or not. And so the Archdiocese of Washington quit giving health benefits to spouses after same-sex marriage happened in the District of Columbia. The scope of the state will expand dramatically if we lose on same-sex marriage.